coming on here and joining me for this discussion. Thank you for everyone, or to everyone, for listening to this conversation. I feel very fortunate to be able to talk to one of the best in the industry on this topic. We're talking to Dr. Greg Haff, and we are going to talk about cluster sets. So first, thank you so much for your flexibility in finding a time to do this. For everyone listening, I'm in the central time zone. Greg is across the ocean. I think there's about a 14-hour difference. So a little earlier for me than what we're used to doing this. Pretty late for you, I'm thinking. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, that's no problem. No problem at all.
So I think most people watching or listening to this know who you are or familiar with your work. I would say especially people familiar with human kinetics know you from your Essentials of Strength Training, 4th edition book. Definitely the Scientific Foundations and Practical Applications of Periodization book, which I always have on my desk for a reference. I really enjoy that book. By the way, for everyone listening, if you haven't got a copy of that book yet, keep listening, but go to the Human Kinetics website right now, pick up your copy. You won't be disappointed. It is so thorough, so informative. And it even has a section in the book about what we're going to talk about today. So go ahead and do that. Greg, like I said, a lot of people are probably familiar with your work, but just to give some perspective, can you give us a little background on your career and experience and why you're interested in this topic?
Well, my career is kind of an interesting one. I actually started out wanting to do computer science and really be in that space, but I always had a passion for sport, and I, started lifting weights when I was 11 with my father, and it's always been a natural place for me to be. And I met a professor at East Stroudsburg University who saw me working out in the weight room and kind of put me on the path. He actually introduced me to the NSCA in 1988.
Okay.
And so, 1 year after the NSCA was founded, I was introduced to the NSCA. And along the journey, I ended up meeting Professor Andy Fry when he was just Andy Fry, the grad student. And he introduced me to Mike Stone, Bill Kramer, Kyle Pierce, John Garhammer, the legends of our field. Yeah. They were all doing research on weightlifting, and I was a junior weightlifter. So the journey started there, and then I spent time with Mike Stone. And anybody who's worked with Mike Stone knows that you kind of sit at a nexus of science, application, coaching, and really forward thinking, especially in the 90s when he was really innovating our profession. So it was really neat to be at the coalface. And the topic that we're going to talk about today was actually something that him and I worked on more so for my own training as an athlete. Okay. And we weren't really doing research at the time. And it wasn't until I finished my PhD in 99, graduating from the University of Kansas, Rock Chalk Jayhawk, love the University of Kansas. It was a great place for me to finish my academic training before I went on to start my own career. And when I got to Appalachian State after graduating, we decided, my wife and I, were going to do some cluster set research, and we did some. And it's been a really interesting journey. My lab now has been doing a lot of work in it with my doctoral student, Yoshi Nagatani. We're doing some really innovative stuff that I think is quite interesting.
So I guess to lay some of the, framework, some of the background here, if people aren't familiar with what cluster sets are, kind of just, start by giving a brief rundown on kind of what those are.
So with cluster sets, it's actually interesting. It's something we started to talk about, in publications in the early 2000s. It's basically putting a rest between repetitions in a set or between groups of repetitions in a set. Now, generally, it's going to be somewhere between about 10 seconds and 45 seconds. It's not really an EMOM.
Okay.
It's a little shorter rest. And the interesting thing is that what it's designed to do is allow you to have a little bit of recovery so that you can maintain the velocity of movement, maybe, and we believe this more so than other people, allow you to lift a heavier weight and have the same velocity loss. My former doctoral student, Dr. James Tufano, his dissertation looked at high volume cluster sets, and we found you could actually lift at a higher percentage of your maximum, do more work, and get potentially a greater stimulus for hypertrophy. So I think a lot of times people get confused with cluster sets. They go right to an EMOM. And I think, EMOMs are great. And a lot of people don't realize that the EMOM is not a new topic. It was talked about by Perry Rader in the 1950s in Ironman magazine with USA Weightlifting. Dr. Jan Todd and I and a postdoc from University of Texas, we actually traced cluster sets origin back to the 1940s.
Wow.
And we've got some things there. Again, Perry Rader talked about these in the 1950s in Ironman magazine. So it's not new. They used it more in that time to kind of get more stimulus, to get more growth and potentially strength gains. And it wasn't until the 70s when Verkhoshansky started to talk about cluster sets in a different way. So we've just kind of taken that early work and we've started to do some new things with modern technology.
Now I know that, and I know you said they're not new as far as my own training and trying to implement some of this for the athletes that I work with. I'm still trying to learn a lot more about it, but I know that especially in your book, you mentioned, the variations of cluster sets that you can go through, whether that's, basic, undulating, wave loaded, ascending, descending. What are some of the differences for those, and how can you kind of implement those?
So I think one of the things that's really interesting about cluster sets, I think we have to frame why we want to use them first. They're not just a jack of all trades kind of tool thing. And I don't think they should be used for every exercise in a training session, because you're just going to extend the duration of the exercise session, so to speak. So for me, when I look at cluster sets, I like the traditional one as my base one. It's kind of the jack of all trades, and I can use it in a strength endurance or hypertrophy phase if I want to increase volume. I could use it in a strength phase, or I could use it in a strength power phase. Now, one of the things that I often tell people is that if I want a lot of recovery, then I only do individual reps in the set with rest. If fatigue and power endurance is kind of my target, I would put multiple reps. So one of the ones we're looking at right now in the work that we're doing at Edith Cowan University is we're looking at sets of 9. So we're doing 3 reps in a cluster, take a break, 3 reps, take a break in 30 seconds roughly. And we're doing a total of 9 with the power clean. And the idea here is to try to increase the work capacity, but also rest so we don't get massive technical breakdown. And what we can see is a maintenance of velocity. So that's the base one. The one that we did previously research was the ascending cluster set. And that was Yoshi's master's study. And with the ascending cluster set, what we're doing is we're adding weight to each set, each cluster, so to speak. So repetition 1 could be 100 kilos, repetition 2 could be 105, repetition 3 could be 110. And then you come back on the next set and you start at 100 again. And the idea that we're working from is that we might get a post-activation performance enhancement on the earlier reps. Now, in Yoshi's work, we didn't see that, but I suspect it's because we didn't load it high enough. And we had too much rest because one of the other supervisors wanted to look at lactate responses. I didn't think that would really do anything. The cluster set wouldn't elevate the lactate that much or really have that much difference. But that extra little bit of rest, I think, mitigated some of the gains that we would expect. So ascending clusters we often use in weightlifting. We would use them in the pre-competition phase, because sometimes when you're in the back room, you're warming up and then something changes on the board and you got to go back down again and come back up again. So it kind of stimulates a similar responsiveness. So with the weightlifters I train, we use that quite frequently. The one that we did the most in my training with Professor Stone was the undulating cluster, which basically is let's have a set of 5 repetitions. You're going to increase the load on each repetition to the 3rd and then come back down. And so I don't really like the term undulating, but since Professor Stone called it that back in the day, I've kept that terminology. I really think it's a pyramid, but that's me. But the idea there is on the back end of the set, we're going to have a post-activation performance enhancement as the load comes down. But it also could be that we're, because we're getting fatigued, lowering the load means the quality of the repetitions could be better. And that one, we actually did a study at Appalachian State in the early 2000s. My wife and I ran that study with the athletics team and the weightlifters we were training.
Mm-hmm.
And we showed that, we could, get some increased velocity in the repetitions on the back end of the pyramid or undulating cluster set. Wave loading is another approach that we've toyed with. We haven't done any research on, so I can only speculate from what we think may happen. Love to get a grad student who'd be interested in doing that work. Mm-hmm. Basically, that would just be, one set's at 100 kilos, we jump to 110, come back to 100, okay. 110, 100. And again, the idea there is that we think that going to the higher load and then coming back down, some sort of performance enhancement might occur.
Okay.
One of the things that you have to think about is the length of the rest between any individual repetition or between any cluster of repetitions. When I say cluster, what I mean is if I'm doing 6 reps, there's multiple ways I can structure it. I could do 1 rep, 30 seconds, 1 rep, 30 seconds, and continue till I complete 6. Or I could do 2 reps, 30 seconds, 2 reps, 30 seconds, 2, get 6. Or I could go 3 and 3. It just depends on the outcome that I'm trying to train. Now, with rest interval, we have to kind of think back to first principles, which is physiology. For me, I'm grounded in physiology. I think we have to understand how the body responds to training. And if we look at the time course of recovery of phosphocreatine, we kind of see that you get some partial recovery up to about 45 seconds. You'll get some. Okay. Obviously, to get complete recovery, we need up to like a couple minutes, 3 minutes or so, or even longer. But the idea is you're going to get a little bit of recovery. So if you want more recovery, then you go out closer to the 30 to 45. If you want less recovery because you're trying to create endurance or create more of that strength endurance, power endurance, then you'll go closer to 15.
Okay.
I think that's important to always think about what your outcome physiologically that you're trying to stimulate, like what adaptation do you want? And if you do that thinking up front, then you can choose the combinations that you want. Obviously, the longer the recovery, probably the higher the loads you can lift in cluster sets. The shorter the recovery, it becomes more metabolically taxing, and then you might get more of those metabolic disturbances. So I think that's an important thing to consider. Now, one of the other things that I always tell people is that when we're loading a cluster set, there's multiple ways that we can do it. So if I'm doing, let's go back to our set of 6, I could take it off of a 6RM, so I'm gonna do 80% of my 6RM, and each rep would be done at that. That does work, and the literature does show that you get higher velocity compared to a traditional set, because we know in a traditional set, as you go from repetitions, across the set, you have a velocity loss. Mm-hmm. And that velocity loss could be 10%, 20, 30. When you start getting close to 40, you're at an RM. Mm-hmm. And so the idea here is that we can slow that velocity loss. But one thing that is really interesting to me is that I could also load it off of the number of repetitions. So for example, I could go off the 1RM if I'm doing singles, mm-hmm. which means I can go at a higher relative percentage. Or if I'm doing doubles, I could go off the 2RM. And the work that Dr. Tufano did in our lab when he was my student, we actually showed you could get more work with the cluster, and you could lift a higher load. And so theoretically, that means you're going to have more stimulus for adaptation. So lifting heavier things more frequently creates mm-hmm. more adaptation if you can recover from it.
Right.
And so the combinations of recovery or intervals between repetitions or between clusters hasn't been dialed in. It's work that we haven't finished. We want to look at different combinations, but oftentimes, as projects go, sometimes that part we don't get to it. We get to the bigger things, because we don't really know what the ideal intervals are going to be. Now, one of the things people are talking about now is rest redistribution, and I have to really clarify that what rest redistribution and cluster sets where they differ is that we have our traditional set. We'll put rest between the individual repetitions or groups of repetitions in the set, And then we'll have our traditional between set rest interval. So 2 minutes, let's say. The proponents of rest redistribution would suggest that you basically you steal rest from the between sets to put it into the sets, so that you don't lengthen the time of the actual session for that exercise. The reality is they create different stimuli, because theoretically you could basically do all your repetitions in a row, every 30 seconds.
Right.
And you don't actually get the recovery. Yeah. So that is a different outcome. Doesn't mean it's a bad outcome, but it's a different stimulus causing a different physiological response. By having the actual between set rest interval stay at 2 minutes, let's say, you're going to get more of the performance gains that you're trying to get, less of the metabolic issues. Now, there is some research that says, they're not very different. But when I look at the subject population, I look at the exercise choices. For me, I prefer to use cluster sets with the Olympic lifts or derivatives. And the reason is that the nexus of a lot of the early work, Carl Miller did some things with USA weightlifting in the 70s. We have Verkhoshansky, has all been mostly the ground-based stuff. So, because you have to account for the extra rest needed to unrack and re-rack a squat or a bench press. Because if I'm continually going in and out, that's actually work.
Yep. And
you can't just stand there and rest between, 30 seconds between repetitions, because the load is on you. So while we have done some work in the back squat, we've had to account for that extra in and out, adding longer rest, basically. But for me, it's about the ground-based stuff. And what we're finding is that with the cluster sets, especially high volume cluster sets, so let's, up to 9 repetitions, that we see different changes in the movement strategy that underpins the barbell trajectory. And Yoshi presented that at NSCA this year. And what he showed was that as we get fatigued, there are slight differences in that barbell trajectory. And weightlifting coaches know this. We want to have an efficient barbell trajectory, because that is indicative of performance. So fundamentally, that's another benefit. But for a non-weightlifter, I think the cluster set offers you the benefit of increasing the velocity of movement with higher loads, thus elevating power output, because power is really just a function of velocity and force.
And I think that brings up a question that I was thinking about ahead of time, in that are there certain lifts, certain exercises, certain lifts that you would stay away from in terms of cluster sets, or just maybe ones that you prefer? I know you said the Olympic lifts are obviously your thing there, but is there anything where you haven't seen more benefit from a cluster set than a traditional set?
So I think that's a great question, and I think that's where the research is. When we start to think about the rest, the cluster set, excuse me, different exercises have different purpose. So for me, the larger mass ground-based exercises are probably where this is going to be the most beneficial in my mind. And most of the work has been done in either derivatives, weightlifting movements, bench press, or back squat, and some in the deadlift. It's really, that is the group that the research body has really examined. Not much in other movements. Like, for example, would it help in a bicep curl? Well, maybe to get higher workload, to get higher stimulus for hypertrophy, but it hasn't really been done. One of the things that we could look at as well is that I wouldn't use it with hang movements, because you got to pick the bar up into the hang movement. So if I'm going to do a cluster set, it's from the floor or from blocks with the derivatives, not a hang motion, because that's extra work that you're adding in every time you take it in and out of the rack. Because really what I'm trying to do with the cluster set is enhance recovery so I can perform better quality work or more work. Now, I see there's a question there about weights on and off the bar. When I do ascending or undulating or descending cluster sets where you strip the load, typically I like to use partners with that, where they take the weights off for me, because we don't want to have that fatigue. Now, one of the things that I don't take credit for this, and I'm not going to take credit for things that I don't come up with. My wife, who is a really phenomenal strength coach, in our lab, we were debating at the whiteboard one day about how we were getting hit in the literature about, oh, cluster sets just add time to the session and it makes a program management problem because, you know, I don't know a strength coach in the world that doesn't say I don't have enough time with my athletes.
Right.
And so we were sitting there trying to, you know, all the sciencey people were banging their heads against the wall, and she's over there doing power cleans, and she puts the bar down and she's like, just do partner clusters. And we're like, what the hell is she talking about? Yeah. So basically what she does in her strength and conditioning practice was, if she would put them in groups of 2, one person lifts, the next person lifts. So the cluster rest is going back and forth between the lifters. And
makes
so
sense.
you match them up with strength. And then she was like, okay, if you're doing undulating, the partner that's resting is loading. And so
there you go.
It's just logical strength coaching knowledge from being in the trenches. And you know, we hadn't thought about it, but it made so much sense to us. So if I wanted to lengthen the rest interval, I could have 3 people working together.
Okay.
You know, I go, you go, the other person goes.
Right.
And so I think that's a really unique way. And the other thing that she talked about, and I would love to do a study on this, she said that she felt it built team cohesiveness because they had to learn to work together.
Yeah.
Because not everybody would be lifting the same weights. They'd be close, but they'd have to work as a group. And I thought that was so novel. And I remember I definitely wrote about it in Paul Comfort's book, where we wrote a chapter on cluster sets, myself and Dr. Mel Harden. And we definitely were like, we're putting this in because we think this is really something that coaches would use. Yeah. So I think that's important as well, to be creative with it.
That makes a ton of sense, especially with the partner thing. I mean, I guess if you're working in a team setting and you have, you know, a lot of athletes, and then you have to find a way to, I don't know, condense your time or use your time more wisely. Yep. Something else you mentioned there, it sounds like, say we're working on Olympic lifts, it would make much more sense than to use cluster sets if you were, you know, doing a snatch or a clean from the floor as opposed to that hang position. Otherwise, I guess unless you have phenomenal grip strength, then you can just hold a weight there forever.
I think it would make fatigue. And so even just hanging it there. But if you went off blocks, you know, you could do blocks from the thigh or the knee. I think that's important. So when you start to look at things that aren't coming from the floor, you've got to think about, okay, what's the extra work of moving in and out of a bench press or a rack in the squat? Now, you know, some companies have, like, down here in Australia, we have a company called Alpha Fit who has an impressive, it's like a mini monolith. It's a J hook that the bar's on, and when you stand up, the J hook swings away. Okay. So you don't have to go in and out. You just stand up. We just got a pair of them for our lab, and I'm really itching to get down there and use them, especially with accentuated eccentrics, because cluster sets are actually applied with accentuated eccentric loading because you have to put the weight releaser back on. So it has to be a cluster set. So that's another way to look at it as well. That's probably, in my mind, an advanced application of a cluster set plus an AEL, which, you know, we do work on as well.
Oh, I'll have to tell one of my athletes, I think last week she did, maybe it was an accidental cluster set. She was on her bench press, and of course she wanted to increase her weight and go for a new PR. Well, I had her doing a set of 5, and she pushed that first rep up, and she set it back. I helped her, but she set it back down and said, man, that was so heavy. And I always like to encourage, never discourage. So I didn't say, okay, let's take some weight off the bar. I just kind of waited to see what her response was. And she sat up and then lay back down and said, okay, I'm going to try it again. And she did 2 more and then had to put it down. And then eventually she got her set of 5. And I guess from my perspective in watching that, even though it wasn't planned, just the confidence that she gained, knowing that she was getting stronger, but she was able to lift that weight. And initially she might have thought that she failed, but she was able to get through that full set with those small rest breaks. So I saw a huge benefit there too.
Oh, Absolutely. Like we see a lot in our weightlifting athletes. Now these are the competitive weightlifters. I mean, I can speak from my own experience. I remember Professor Stone. I mean, he used to do, clusters, a set of 3 clustered individually. And I mean, my last set would be at 95% of my best clean and jerk. And he would only put 30 seconds in between and try clipping at like 85, 90, 95% with only 30 seconds in between in a full clean. I mean, it's got a huge, physical task to overcome. But the confidence when you get to competition and people start messing with the competitive board and your rest interval comes down, you can do it because you've done it in training. And so I definitely do use it with my weightlifters to build their confidence getting close to a competition. Because I feel as if that condensing of that rest interval, they've got to get the mental energy to kind of focus to put the energy into the lift. So there's a physiological, but there's also a psychological effect of the cluster set, I think.
I guess looking in terms of programming, maybe more directly the periodization, is there a time when, say, you would want to use this for power development, a time in the periodization when you would utilize cluster sets more than others?
So I know Yoshi and I wrote a really nice paper that is published in the Professional Strength and Conditioning Journal out of the UK, where we tried to line up, and I also did it in the book chapter in Paul Comfort's book, where we tried to say, all right, which cluster set models fit best with which phase of the periodized model? And so the way I look at it is, if I am in, for example, a pre-competition and speed strength is really my focus, then I'm going to want longer rest intervals, less reps in the set. The load has to be chosen to optimize speed or power output. There's some wonderful work coming out with like plyometrics, like jump squats and things with cluster sets. So you could use multiple constructs there. For example, you could use the undulating because you get the PAPE effect and you get some strength. The traditional one, just a straight cluster set is every phase it works in. It's the base paradigm. And I think you can't go wrong with using that. And in fact, most athletes, I think, that type of cluster set has benefit. The more advanced ones, I think you have to kind of align them with the more advanced athletes that need more variation. One thing I would highlight about cluster sets with novices, and this was something, again, that my wife, influences me a lot. She basically said that she likes the cluster set with novices because then she can have them rest and get coaching when they're learning a task. So, use a 45-second rest, give the athlete a point to focus on. All right, you did really well on that. Let's focus on this on the next rep and then go again. And then as they get more confident, that technique will become more solid.
That makes sense. And then you're not, I guess in terms of what you just said there, you're not sacrificing form or technique in getting that rest break. And I know you mentioned that a little bit earlier too. All right, so practical time for some application for some people listening, something that they can take away directly and go ahead and use it right now. We're getting ready for spring sports seasons. Say I have an athlete in preseason, or maybe they're already in their season. What would a training session look like if you were implementing cluster sets?
So cluster sets, there's one really wonderful article about this that was written by Jay Omer and Fred Roll when they were at Tulane University in the 80s. And what they did is they used cluster sets in the preseason, leading in. And if you think about it, you're like, why did they use it then? Well, we're going to start to work on strength, speed, or speed strength at that point as we're getting ready for the season. So we could use that cluster set. Remember, one of the benefits of clusters is I can lift a heavier load. So I could get more strength stimulus, yet still get some speed stimulus with the lifts that I choose. And so for me, I would suggest that if I'm going into preseason, let's go into some of these cluster sets. Now, if I'm in season, I actually think the cluster set has benefit as well, because I get a big stimulus, but I don't have as much fatigue potentially. Because I've got that little extra recovery. Now, from a session perspective, for me, I would only use it in the weightlifting derivatives or the targeted main exercise. Some exercises, I just want fatigue. I need that fatigue.
Makes sense.
And so we would do, for example, let's say I start with my power clean. So my power clean may be clustered. My clean pulls may not be, because I just want stimulus. And, then we would move through our session with other exercises depending on the focus of the session and your philosophy, so to speak. Right. You could do 2 exercises in a session, like one, for example, I might do, I don't know, use it for my power cleans, and let's say I do want to use it with my bench press. I just got to wait for a little bit more rest so I get the recovery to rack and unrack.
Sure.
And so I could do that, but I wouldn't go crazy with too many cluster sets, because remember, you're adding extra rest, which means your workout session, you're taking time from your session.
Right.
So it's for me, as I get older and I start to think about programming more, and I reflect on things I've done as an athlete, as a coach, the mistakes I've made as a coach, because I think we all make mistakes. I think one of the things that is important is to be a little bit more simple when you're programming, do the big rocks well. So if I can use the cluster set in that, and I keep going to weightlifting derivatives, but I'm definitely someone who believes in weightlifting derivatives. They really work well there. And so if I can use them there appropriately, I can, do other things for other attributes that I'm trying to train. Now, I will say that if you're in a general prep phase of your periodized plan and you're doing strength endurance or hypertrophy work, I would say that cluster sets have a place. But I would use higher volume, bigger repetition clusters. So, for example, in my own training, I've done, let's say I'm doing sets of 10. I might do, or let's say 12 sets of 12. I might do three clusters of 4. And so I get a little bit of rest, but I still get some of that metabolic fatigue that I need to stimulate the hormonal response that I might want to have to underpin some of the adaptive responses, realizing that the hormones are not the main driver, it's part of the driver. Mechanical tension's the driver. So I can lift a heavier weight more frequently, get the metabolic disturbance, potentially get greater adaptation. And in that strength endurance phase, I'm trying to get more work capacity. So lift heavier things, build more work capacity. And that seems to work really well. But you have to be very cognizant of the loads that you're applying. And then you definitely need to think about heavy and light days, where some days are heavier, but some days are lighter, because you can really grind someone if you go too hard too often.
Yeah. That makes sense. And all getting back to fatigue management and your rest and recovery to make sure that you stay on the top of your game. This has been a fascinating conversation. I know it's getting late where you're at, so I want to be respectful of that. I know you keep a very busy schedule, but for everyone listening, please look Greg up. Like we mentioned earlier, the 4th edition of the Essentials of Strength Training and Conditioning, the periodization book. I know you talked a lot about developing power, which you have a chapter in there. Tons of great insight. I'll let you kind of wrap it up here if you have any final words on cluster sets, and definitely let people know where they can, find your research and keep up on all the information that you're putting out.
So I think for me with cluster sets, I always tell people this, and I'm kind of on this kick right now. Nothing is new.
Right.
I just recently, myself and a colleague from Italy, we just submitted a paper where we translated Kotoff's book from 1916. And he was talking about autoregulation in 1916 of training. Wow. And so, autoregulation is kind of the hot term right now. It's not new. Cluster sets are not a new construct. Now, how we apply them may be different, or how we analyze them may be different, but the main goals of them haven't really changed, and they've been around for a while. Take-home messages, I personally think cluster sets are best suited for weightlifting movements, derivatives, deadlifting, those kind of exercises that are coming from the ground or blocks. I think that they can be used with squatting, but you have to be cognizant of the extra work going in and out of the rack. And I think that's important. Obviously, my book has some things on cluster sets. And we put that in there because I think it's a really important training tool. And I do believe we have a little bit in essentials in the new edition whenever that gets done, because we're working really hard to get that over the line. And hopefully that's going to be completed in the next year. But where you can find me, I'm on LinkedIn. I put things up there periodically. I'm obviously on Instagram. I don't do as much with Twitter anymore. I've been doing a little bit with Blue Sky, but I go on both. To be honest, for me, really, lately, it's just been Instagram and LinkedIn. And I'm easily found at Edith Cowan University. I always answer my email. And then I try to hit the conference circuit frequently. I know we've got about 3 abstracts going in about cluster sets for NSCA this year in Kansas. I'm really excited to get back to Kansas. I had a really good time there as an athlete and as a student. So I'm excited to visit the Jayhawk Athletic Performance Lab and spend some time with someone I really cherish in Professor Fry, who has influenced me not only as a friend, but as a colleague and a mentor. So I definitely will be at NSCA, I guarantee it. Already registered. So that's an important one for me. So yeah, I think I'm pretty easy to get in touch with. I make an effort to try to respond to people as best I can.